The sun beat down relentlessly over the Arizona Territory when Margaret Williams stepped off the stagecoach at Fort Apache. His blue eyes, accustomed to the paved streets of Boston, blinked several times at the reddish dust that danced in the air. Her brown hair, once meticulously tied into an elegant bun, now sported unruly locks after 3 days of traveling through wilderness territory. The trading post was bustling with a peculiar mix of settlers, cavalry soldiers, and Navajo natives who came to trade. Margaret clutched her medical bag to her chest, feeling the weight of her decision and her secrets as she surveyed the new world that would be her home. "Dr. Williams?" A deep voice made her turn around. A tall man with tanned skin and long hair as black as night stared at her intensely. He wore a combination of traditional Navajo clothing with Western elements, a leather vest over a white shirt. "I am Fire Eagle, chief of the Navajo tribe of the Red Mountains." Margaret felt her heart quicken at the imposing presence of the indigenous leader. It was not just his majestic appearance that struck her, but something in his dark eyes that seemed to carry both wisdom and sadness. "Yes, it's me," he replied, extending his hand in a professional gesture that he soon realized was inappropriate to local customs. Fire Eagle, however, accepted the greeting with a slight smile, revealing his familiarity with the customs of the white people. "Our tribe has eagerly awaited your arrival," he said, leading her away from the hustle and bustle of the post. "The fever has taken many of our people, especially children." As they walked, Margaret noticed the curious and not always friendly looks that followed them. A white woman accompanied by a Navajo chief was not a common sight, much less accepted in those parts. "Frank Morrison won't be happy to see you around here," Fire Eagle commented, referring to the region's influential landowner. "He has his own plans for our lands." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. The name Morrison brought back memories she preferred to keep buried in her Boston past. "I didn't come here to please Frank Morrison," he replied firmly. "I came to save lives." Arriving at the Navajo camp was a moment of revelation for Margaret. Traditional tents dotted the valley, while women worked at looms and children played, despite the disease that ravaged the community. The beauty and simplicity of the place contrasted sharply with the sophistication of the Boston she had left behind. An old woman approached, her wrinkled eyes fixed on Margaret. "This is my mother, Silver Moon," Fire Eagle introduced. She had a vision about his coming. Margaret watched as the elder spoke in Navajo to her son. Fire Eagle translated, "She says that you carry a heavy shadow in your heart, but that your spirit is strong as the desert wind." The old woman's words hit Margaret like well-aimed arrows. How could that woman know about her pain, about the real reason that brought her there? That same night, while tending to the first sick children in a makeshift tent as an infirmary, Margaret heard the first gunshots. Fire Eagle quickly entered, his eyes shining with urgency. "Morrison's men," he said, picking up his rifle. "They're trying to intimidate us again." "Let me help," Margaret offered, but Fire Eagle stopped her with a gesture. "You are already helping. Take care of our people. I will protect the camp." Before leaving, he hesitated, turning to her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Margaret, there is something I need to do. A sacred pact of protection." In a quick gesture, he cut his own palm with a knife, holding it out to her. "Among my people, the blood pact is stronger than any promise. Allow me to protect you as you protect my people." Margaret knew that moment would change her life forever. With trembling hands, she allowed him to make a small cut in her palm, and when their hands came together, sealing the pact with blood, she felt an electric current run through her entire body. The shots continued in the distance, but at that moment, something deeper and more dangerous began to be born. The love that blossomed between them was like a desert flower, beautiful and resistant, but surrounded by thorns and dangers. "I'll keep you safe," Fire Eagle promised, his eyes reflecting the flames of the campfire. "But there's something I need to know. Why does Morrison upset you so much? What secret do you carry?" Margaret looked away, feeling the weight of her past stronger than ever. How could I tell him that Frank Morrison was more than just an enemy? How do you reveal that the man who threatened your tribe was intimately linked to the reason you fled Boston? "Some secrets are like poisonous snakes," she replied, repeating a saying she had heard from the old woman earlier. "The longer they stay hidden, the more deadly they become." Fire Eagle nodded, understanding that there was more to the story than Margaret was ready to reveal. For now, the blood pact and the promise of protection would have to be enough. As night settled over Navajo country, Margaret tended the sick, her hands still stained with the blood of the covenant, her heart torn between duty and a budding love that promised to be as dangerous as it was beautiful. On the horizon, the torchlight of Morrison's men shone like evil stars, a constant reminder that her past was closer than she would like. The first day in Arizona was over, but the real battle, both for the heart and for survival, was just beginning. The morning after the blood pact brought with it not only the scorching heat of Arizona, but also palpable tension in the Navajo camp. Margaret worked tirelessly in the infirmary tent, her skilled hands tending to the feverish children, while her mind wandered between the present and the memories she fought so hard to forget. "The fever is breaking in some of them," reported the Fire Eagle, who had just entered the tent. Their eyes met briefly, and Margaret felt that same electricity from the night before run through her body. "We need more quinine," she replied, trying to remain professional. "And clean water, lots of clean water." The Navajo chief nodded, but before he could respond, a young warrior hurried into the tent, speaking rapidly in his native language. Fire Eagle's countenance instantly hardened. "Frank Morrison is at the trading post," he translated for Margaret. "He's asking about you." Margaret felt her stomach drop. His hands, normally steady when performing medical procedures, began to shake slightly. "He can't find me here," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. "The pact we made was not in vain." Fire Eagle gently touched her arm, a gesture that sent waves of heat through her skin. "But I need to know what kind of snake we're dealing with." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, knowing she could no longer delay the truth. "Frank Morrison was my fiancé in Boston," he finally revealed, his voice barely above a whisper. He's not the man he appears to be." The silence that followed was as heavy as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Fire Eagle showed no surprise, only a deeper understanding formed in his eyes. "There's more," Margaret continued, her words coming out as if each one were a heavy stone. "He was involved in a scheme to steal Indian land in the East. I discovered documents, proof of his actions. People died, Fire Eagle. Entire tribes were displaced. And you ran away with this evidence," he added, finally understanding the weight of the secret she was carrying. "Yes, the documents are hidden in Boston with trusted people. If something happens to me, they will be revealed." At that moment, Silvermoon entered the tent, her wise eyes watching the scene with concern. She said something in Navajo, and Margaret noticed how Fire Eagle tensed. "My mother says Morrison is not alone," he translated. "There are armed men with him, and they're not just ordinary goons, they're government agents." Margaret felt her blood run cold in her veins. "The same ones who helped you in the East," he murmured. "They must have tracked me here." A child's cry cut through the tension of the moment, calling Margaret back to her duties. As she turned to tend to the little patient, Fire Eagle watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You risk your life to protect my people twice," he said, "first as a doctor, now with this information." I couldn't remain silent and watch yet another tribe be destroyed by greed, she replied, applying a cold compress to the feverish child's forehead. Even if it means... Meaning what? He asked, approaching. Even if it means never being able to have a normal life again, she added, her voice filled with sadness. Never again being able to fall in love without fear. The look they exchanged at that moment said more than 1,000 words. Fire Eagle took a step towards them, but they were interrupted by another warrior bringing urgent news. Morrison is coming this way, Fire Eagle announced, his voice tense. With your men. I can't put your people in danger. Margaret began to gather her things hurriedly. I need to leave. No, Fire Eagle's voice was firm as rock. The blood pact is not something that is easily broken. Furthermore, he took her hand, observing the still fresh mark of the cut. There is something between us that is stronger than any threat. Silvermoon began to sing softly, an ancient chant that seemed to echo through the tent walls. Margaret didn't understand the words, but she felt their power, their promise of protection. There are tunnels, Fire Eagle explained, ancient sacred paths under the mountains. We can hide you there until we think of a plan. The sound of approaching horses' hooves made Margaret make her decision. Heart pounding, she followed Fire Eagle out of the tent, through a hidden path among the rocks. Before they disappeared into the tunnel entrance, she took one last look at the camp. Frank Morrison had just arrived, his imposing figure contrasting against the Arizona sky. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the fury in his eyes as he searched the room with his gaze. He won't give up easily, she murmured. Neither do we, Fire Eagle replied, guiding her into the darkness of the tunnel. Not even the love that is growing between us. As they entered the ancient sacred paths, Margaret knew she was walking not only away from danger, but toward a destiny that would change her life forever. The echo of his footsteps mingled with the beat of his heart, and Fire Eagle's hand on his was like an anchor amid the approaching storm. Sacred tunnels snaked beneath the mountains like ancient veins of the earth, their walls marked by Navajo symbols that told stories of generations past. Margaret followed Fire Eagle through the darkness, guided only by the flickering light of a torch and the steady touch of his hand. These tunnels are known only to our people, Fire Eagle explained, his voice echoing softly. They were used by our ancestors in times of war and need. Margaret watched the shadows dance on the rocky walls, thinking about how her life had changed so drastically in just 2 days. The distant sound of voices and horses' hooves could still be heard, reminding her of the threat that pursued them. Frank has always been obsessed with power, she revealed, as they rested in a natural chamber. In Boston, he hid his nature well behind polite smiles and fine clothes. But I saw his true face the night I discovered the documents. Fire Eagle sat beside him, the glow of the torch highlighting the strong features of his face. What happened that night? I was a nurse at the Boston hospital, Margaret began, her voice shaking slightly. Frank left his briefcase in my office by accident. Inside were letters, contracts, evidence of how he had manipulated government decisions to take indigenous lands. It wasn't just business. There were deaths involved, entire villages destroyed. Tears began to form in her eyes. When he found out that I knew his look, it was as if a mask had fallen. He tried to convince me that it was all for our future, that with that money, we could have the life we dreamed of. But all I could think about were the families destroyed, the lives lost. Fire Eagle remained silent for a moment, processing the revelation. And now he seeks to do the same to my people. Yes, Margaret confirmed, but this time I will not remain silent. I cannot allow this story to repeat itself. A distant noise made them alert. Fire Eagle quickly extinguished the torch, plunging them into total darkness. Their bodies were close, and Margaret could feel his heat, hear his controlled breathing. "Someone is in the tunnels," he whispered. "But it's impossible. Only our people know these passages. Unless—" Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. "Someone betrayed you." Realization fell over them like a heavy shadow. Fire Eagle took her hand and began to guide her through the darkness, his steps as silent as a predator. Years of knowledge of the tunnels allowed him to move without light. "There's a secret exit that leads to the mountains," he muttered. "If we can reach her—" His words were interrupted by the sound of rocks rolling not far away. Margaret felt her heart quicken, but she stood firm, trusting Fire Eagle's guidance. They advanced slowly when voices began to echo through the tunnels. One of them Margaret recognized instantly. The soft, controlled voice of Frank Morrison, who had so often whispered promises of love into her ears in Boston. "We know they're here," Morrison's voice reverberated off the walls. "There's nowhere to run, Margaret. Be sensible. You know you can't trust these savages." Fire Eagle felt Margaret shiver and squeezed her hand in support. They continued moving, more quickly now, as voices and footsteps seemed to approach from various directions. "There's something I need to tell you," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "The night I fled Boston, Frank, he killed someone, a young Indian messenger who was helping me. That's why I chose to come here, to his tribe. It wasn't just to escape. It was to try to make up for that death in some way." Fire Eagle stopped for a moment, turning to face her in the darkness. Even without seeing his face, Margaret could feel the intensity of his gaze. "You carry a lot of pain," he said softly, touching her face, "but also a lot of strength." A gunshot echoed through the tunnels, making them move again. The sound of voices and footsteps was closer now, coming from multiple directions. They were being surrounded. "Trust me," Fire Eagle whispered, guiding her to what appeared to be a narrow crack in the wall. "This is a sacred path. Our ancestors say only those with pure hearts can traverse it." Margaret felt the space tight around her as they slipped through the passage. The air was colder here, and a faint natural glow was beginning to become visible. Crystals on the walls that emitted a soft, almost mystical light. "It's true what they say about you," she murmured as they advanced, "that you have the gift of speaking to the spirits of the land." "My mother taught me to listen to the ancient voices," he replied. "Now they show us the way." The passage began to widen, leading them to a larger chamber where crystal-clear water gushed from the rocks. The sound of their pursuers had faded, but was still present, a constant reminder of the danger. "This place is sacred," Fire Eagle explained, his voice reverent. "The water that springs here is considered medicine by the elders." Margaret watched in amazement as a new sound reached them, Navajo war cries echoing through the tunnels. Fire Eagle smiled for the first time since they entered the caves. "My warriors," he said. "They found our pursuers." Sounds of fighting began to echo through the passages, but Fire Eagle continued to guide Margaret forward. "We need to reach the exit. My men will give us time." As they walked forward, Margaret realized that something had changed between them. The shared danger, the exchanged revelations, the constant touch of their hands in the darkness, all of it had created a connection deeper than any blood pact. "When this is all over," she said softly, "I want to learn more about your people, about your customs. And I want to learn more about the brave woman who defied an empire for justice," he replied, his voice filled with admiration and something else, something that made Margaret's heart beat faster. Daylight was beginning to filter through a distant opening, promising freedom, but they both knew this was just a pause in the battle to come. Frank Morrison wouldn't give up easily, and the secrets Margaret carried could still destroy much more than just a budding romance. The light of dawn found Margaret and Fire Eagle emerging from the sacred tunnels on a high plateau of the Red Mountains. The cool morning air carried the scent of wild sage, contrasting sharply with the damp, heavy atmosphere of the caves they had left behind. "Will the warriors be able to reach us here?" asked Margaret, as she watched the Navajo camp in the distance, a collection of tiny dots in the valley below. "Yes," Fire Eagle replied, his watchful eyes scanning the horizon. "We have established meeting points for situations like this. Silvermoon will be able to guide you." Margaret unconsciously touched the cut on her palm, the blood pact mark still sensitive. The previous night's revelations weighed heavily on his conscience, along with the growing certainty that his feelings for Fire Eagle had transformed into something much deeper than gratitude or admiration. "I need to get back to camp," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "There are sick children who depend on me." Fire Eagle approached, his intense gaze meeting hers. "Morrison and his men will still be there looking for you." "Then let them look," she replied with determination. "I can't abandon my patients out of fear. I already ran away once in Boston. I won't run away again." A discreet smile appeared on the Navajo chief's lips. "You have the spirit of a warrior," he said, gently touching her face. "But we need to be as smart as the fox to win this battle." The distant sound of horses' hooves interrupted the moment. Both ducked instinctively, seeking cover behind large rocks. A group of riders approached from the trail below, red dust rising beneath their horses' hooves. "They are my men," Fire Eagle whispered, recognizing the particular signals the warriors exchanged. "And they brought news." The riders reached the plateau, quickly dismounting. The youngest of them, whom Margaret recognized as Swift Wind, approached urgently, speaking rapidly in Navajo. With each word, Fire Eagle's face became more tense. "What happened?" asked Margaret, feeling her heart sink. "Morrison found out who betrayed him in Boston," Fire Eagle translated, his voice gravelly. "The Indian messenger who helped you, he had a brother. This brother now works for Morrison, seeking revenge on you because he believes your actions led to the death of his family member." Margaret felt her legs weaken. "But I never wanted to. I tried to protect him." "Pain can blind a man," Fire Eagle replied, holding his shoulders gently, "making him see enemies where there are only other victims." Another warrior approached, handing Fire Eagle something. A medicine bag that Margaret recognized as her own, left behind in the infirmary tent. "Silvermoon sent it," he explained. "Along with a message, the circle needs to close where it started." Margaret frowned, trying to decipher the meaning of the old woman's words. "The circle? Boston? The documents?" "No," Fire Eagle replied, his eyes shining with understanding. "The trading post. That's where it all started here in Arizona. That's where Morrison keeps his own documents, his plans for our lands." "If we could get proof of his new schemes," Margaret began, her medical mind working quickly. "We could link it to the evidence I left in Boston. It would be enough to stop him permanently." A plan began to form, dangerous but necessary. Fire Eagle gathered his warriors, distributing instructions in his native tongue. Margaret watched, in awe of her leadership abilities, the way each warrior listened attentively and nodded respectfully. "Morrison keeps an office at the back of the station," he explained to Margaret. "My men will create a distraction at the front, while we—" "No," she interrupted, touching his arm. "I must go alone. If something goes wrong, your people cannot be held responsible." "The blood pact." "The pact protects me," she said softly, "but it also gives me the responsibility to protect you and your tribe. This is my fight, Fire Eagle. Let me fight it." He watched her for a long time, the conflict visible in his dark eyes. Finally, he nodded. "But you won't be completely alone. Swift Wind will discreetly accompany you, and I will be nearby with the other warriors, ready to intervene if necessary. Margaret smiled, feeling her heart accelerate not only from the imminent danger, but from the intensity of the look they shared. Without thinking, she approached and kissed him, a soft touch but full of promises. "For luck," she whispered, blushing slightly. "Among my people," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion, "we say that a kiss before battle guarantees that the spirits will guide our path back to each other." The sun was high when they began their descent from the mountains, each following different paths, but with the same destination. Margaret knew that the next few hours would determine not only her future, but the future of everyone who had become important to her. As she walked, she thought of the young messenger who had died in Boston, of the brother who now sought revenge, of Frank Morrison and his destructive greed, and of Fire Eagle, the man who had awakened in her heart a love stronger than any fear. The trading post was already visible in the distance, a solid building that stood out against the blue Arizona sky. Margaret clutched her medicine bag to her chest, where she had hidden a small revolver, a precaution she hoped she wouldn't need to use. "May the spirits guide us," she murmured, repeating the words she had heard Silvermoon say so many times. And then, with firm steps, he began his walk towards the confrontation that could change everything. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the Fort Apache trading post as Margaret approached the wooden building, her heart pounding against her chest. His medicine bag, carrying both medical instruments and the small revolver, seemed to weigh a ton. Each step brought her closer not only to confronting Frank Morrison, but also to her own past. "Dr. Williams!" The deep voice of the merchant, Mr. Peterson, greeted her as she entered. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought you were at the Navajo camp." "I came to get more medical supplies," she replied with studied ease, noticing the stares of Morrison's men spread throughout the establishment. "The epidemic is consuming our stock quickly." While talking to Peterson about medication, Margaret discreetly observed the back of the store, where Morrison's office was located. Through the dusty window she could see movement. Her ex-fiancé was inside, probably planning his next move against the Fire Eagle tribe. "Miss Williams!" A familiar voice made her freeze. Or should I say, my future wife. Frank Morrison emerged from his office like a snake from its hole. He still wore expensive suits, even in the Arizona heat, and his polite smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "I'm no longer your fiancé, Frank," she replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "That life stayed in Boston, along with his lies." "Lies," he laughed softly, moving closer. "I prefer to call it strategic business, like the ones I intend to do here. It would be easier if you didn't interfere, dear." The sound of hooves and screams from outside interrupted the conversation. Fire Eagle's planned distraction had begun. Morrison frowned, ordering his men to investigate. "Interesting timing," he commented, his eyes never leaving Margaret. "Your new wild friends seem very well organized." "They're not wild," she countered. "These are people with rights to their land, rights that you plan to steal, just as you did in the East." Morrison grabbed her arm, dragging her to his office as chaos ensued outside. "Don't you understand, Margaret? Everything I did, every decision, was to build an empire that would be ours. An empire built on blood and suffering," she replied, freeing herself from his grip. His eyes quickly darted around the room, spotting a leather briefcase on the desk, similar to the one he had found in Boston. "What about the messenger?" she asked, trying to keep him distracted as she discreetly approached the table. "Was it also just a strategic business?" Morrison's face darkened. "That stuck-up Indian found out too much, just like your brother found out about your involvement in his death." "My involvement?" Margaret felt her anger rising. "You killed him. I tried to save him." "And that's exactly what I told his brother." Morrison smiled cruelly. How you used him to steal important documents and then left him to die. He believed every word. The sound of gunfire outside grew more intense. Margaret knew she needed to act quickly. In one quick movement, he grabbed the folder from the table, but Morrison was faster, grabbing his arm. "Still so predictable," he scoffed. "You knew you'd try something like this. Why do you think I left the folder so conveniently in plain sight?" Just then, the office window exploded in a shower of glass as swift wind burst through it, knocking Morrison down. Margaret took advantage of the confusion to pull the revolver from her purse, pointing it at her ex-fiancé. "Where are the real documents, Frank?" she demanded, her hands shaking slightly. Morrison, still on the ground, began to laugh. "In the safe, of course, but you'll never find the combination." 7218, said a new voice from the door. It was the brother of the dead messenger, his eyes burning with hatred. "The date of my brother's death." Margaret and Morrison looked at him in surprise. The man advanced, his expression a mask of suppressed fury. "I worked for you just to find out the truth," he told Morrison. "And now I know who really killed my brother." Shots sounded closer, and Margaret heard Fire Eagle's voice calling her name outside. Time was running out. "The safe," she ordered Morrison, keeping the gun pointed. "Open it." With the messenger's brother watching him closely, Morrison had no choice. His hands shook slightly as he turned the safe's dial, revealing a stack of documents inside. "Take everything," Margaret instructed the messenger's brother. "Your tribe deserves to know the truth as much as the Navajo." As the papers were removed from the safe, Morrison tried one last desperate move, pulling out a hidden gun. But before he could shoot, an arrow went through the broken window, hitting his hand and causing the gun to fall. Fire Eagle appeared at the door, his bow still in position. "It's over, Morrison," he said with authority. "Your lies no longer have power here." Margaret felt immense relief course through her body, but she knew the battle was not completely over. Outside, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by excited voices. The lawmen from Fort Apache had arrived. "The documents will prove everything," she said, putting away her revolver. "Both the crimes in Boston and the plans for Navajo land." Morrison, holding his injured hand, stared at her with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "Did you really choose them over me? All the power and wealth we could have?" "I chose the truth," she replied simply, moving to stand next to Fire Eagle. "And true love." When officers entered the office, they found not only evidence of Morrison's crimes, but also two tribes united for justice, and an Eastern doctor who had found her true destiny in the Wild West. As Morrison was taken into custody, Margaret looked at Fire Eagle, seeing in his eyes the same love that made her heart race. The blood pact they had made was just the beginning of a much deeper union, a union that promised to heal not just bodies, but also hearts wounded by the past. The setting sun turned the Arizona sky crimson as Margaret and Fire Eagle returned to the Navajo camp. Frank Morrison's arrest had brought a sense of momentary relief, but both knew that the consequences of their actions would echo for a long time. "The children need to be checked," Margaret said, dismounting her horse with Fire Eagle's help. The touch of his hands, however brief, sent that familiar electric current through his body. "The fever may have worsened during our absence." "You need to rest too," he replied, his dark eyes studying the dark circles forming under her eyes. "The last few days have been intense." Margaret smiled softly, touching the scar that was beginning to form on her palm, the mark of the blood pact that had changed her life. "Rest can wait. There is much work to be done." In the infirmary tent, Silvermoon was already taking care of the sick children, applying her ancestral knowledge of medicinal herbs. The old woman smiled when she saw Margaret, saying something in Navajo that made Fire Eagle nod respectfully. My mother says the spirits were right about you, he translated. Your heart is strong as the mountains, but gentle as the spring wind. While examining her little patients, Margaret reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a few days. The refined Boston doctor had found her true purpose among a people many of her former acquaintances would consider savages. The fever is breaking in some of them, she observed, placing her hand on the forehead of a sleeping girl. Their traditional medicines, combined with quinine, are having an effect. Silvermoon approached, offering Margaret an herbal infusion. The elder spoke again, her words carrying a warning tone that made Fire Eagle frown. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, noticing the change in her expression. "She says Morrison's capture is just the beginning," he translated. "Others will come, seeking the lands he promised to sell. Powerful men do not give up easily on their plans." As if to confirm his words, a young warrior hurriedly entered the tent, bringing news from the fort. Government agents working with Morrison had disappeared, taking copies of some documents with them. "They will try to continue Morrison's plan," Margaret said, feeling the weight of worry return to her shoulders. "Even with him in prison, the threat to Navajo lands continues." Fire Eagle walked over, taking your hands in his. "Then we will fight again. My people have defended these lands for generations. We will not give up now." A child's cry interrupted the moment, calling Margaret back to her duties. As she tended to the little patient, Fire Eagle watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," he said softly. "The pact we made was not just one of protection, but of unity. My strength is your strength." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. "Sometimes I wonder if I haven't put your tribe in more danger by coming here. If my secrets and my past haven't brought more problems than solutions." Silvermoon, even without fully understanding the English words, seemed to sense Margaret's anguish. The old woman approached, placing her hands on the young doctor's shoulders and beginning a soft chant, an ancient prayer of healing and protection. "My mother says you were sent by the spirits," Fire Eagle translated, his voice full of emotion, "that your path to us was no accident but destiny." Outside the tent, the sounds of the camp continued, children playing, women working at their looms, warriors keeping watch. It was a simple life, but rich in meaning and connection, everything Margaret had secretly longed for in her previous life in Boston. "Tomorrow I will ride to the fort," Fire Eagle announced. "I need to speak to the authorities about the missing documents and the fugitive agents." "I'll go with you," said Margaret promptly, but he shook his head. "You are needed most here. The children need your care, and my mother can teach you more about our traditional medicines." Margaret wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. Her place was there, healing and learning, building bridges between two worlds that had remained separate for so long. "Just promise you'll be careful," she pleaded, touching his tanned face. "There are still many who do not accept a Navajo chief entering an American fort demanding justice." "I promise," he replied, leaning down to kiss her softly. "And I also promise that when I return, we will talk about our future, about how we can unite our lives not just through a blood pact, but in a way that both our peoples can understand and respect." Margaret's heart quickened at his words. The idea of a future with Fire Eagle, of a life dedicated to both medicine and the preservation of Navajo culture, seemed like a dream she barely dared believe possible. When he left the next morning, Margaret watched him ride toward the horizon, his haughty profile silhouetted against the dawn sky. Silvermoon was by her side, and even without shared words, both women understood that the next few days would bring new challenges. "May the spirits protect you," Margaret murmured in English, to which Silvermoon responded with words in Navajo that, even without understanding, she felt carried the same feeling of hope and protection. Work in the infirmary tent awaited her, along with the traditional medicine lessons that the old woman had promised to teach. It was a new day in Arizona territory, and with it the promise that love, even surrounded by danger and uncertainty, would find its way. Dawn brought unrest to the Navajo camp. It was the second day since Fire Eagle had left for the fort, and Margaret divided her time between tending to the patients and watching the horizon, hoping to see the familiar silhouette of her beloved returning. "He should have come back yesterday," she murmured to Silvermoon, who was preparing a new infusion of medicinal herbs. The elderly woman, although she didn't understand the exact words, perfectly understood the concern in her voice. The sick children were recovering well, thanks to the combination of modern medicine and the ancient knowledge of the Navajo. Margaret had learned much in recent days about the healing power of desert plants, and each new lesson with Silvermoon further strengthened her connection with the people who had become her family. Night's approaching. The warning cry of one of the warriors broke the peaceful routine of the morning. Margaret ran out of the infirmary tent, her heart racing with the anticipation of seeing Fire Eagle. However, his blood ran cold when he recognized the uniforms of the government agents who had worked with Morrison. "They did not come in peace," said Swift Wind, who had remained at the camp to protect her. "There are many armed men with them." Margaret watched the group approach, at least 20 men, all armed to the teeth. Among them, he recognized Agent Charles Whitney, Morrison's closest collaborator in the land grab schemes. "Where is Fire Eagle?" she asked Swift Wind, her worry increasing by the second. "Perhaps they intercepted him at the fort," replied the young warrior, his hand already on his rifle. "We need to prepare to fight." Silvermoon began to gather the women and children, guiding them to the sacred tunnels that had served as their refuge days before. Margaret, however, knew that running away was not an option this time. "Miss Williams!" Whitney's voice echoed through the camp as the group stopped at a safe distance. "We have unfinished business to discuss." Margaret took a few steps forward, ignoring Swift Wind's protests. "Where's Fire Eagle?" she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Whitney smiled, a cold smile reminiscent of Morrison. "Your savage boss is being held at the fort. It appears there are serious charges against him. Something about stealing federal documents and conspiracy." "Lies!" cried Margaret. "You are the real criminals here." "Ah, but who will believe you?" replied Whitney, dismounting her horse. "A doctor on the run, living among savages, plotting against the progress of civilization. Frank Morrison may be in prison, but his plans for these lands will continue." The Navajo warriors who had remained at the camp formed a defensive line, their weapons ready. Margaret knew they were outnumbered, but she also knew they couldn't give in. "We have a simple proposal," Whitney continued, taking a few more steps. "Hand over the original documents you stole from Morrison, both those from Boston and those here, and your precious Indian chief will be released. Refuse, and he will face the gallows for his alleged crimes." Margaret felt the world spin for a moment. The idea of Fire Eagle being held prisoner, threatened with death, was almost unbearable. But handing over the documents would mean condemning the entire tribe to losing their land. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked, trying to stall for time. "Until sundown," Whitney replied. "And don't try any tricks. We have men guarding all the exits from the valley." When the agents moved away to set up camp nearby, Margaret met with the warriors and Silvermoon in the main tent. The old woman spoke quickly in Navajo, her words translated by Swift Wind. "She says the spirits are restless," he translated. "There is more to this situation than meets the eye. Fire Eagle would not be captured so easily. Unless—" Margaret trailed off, an idea popping into her mind. "Unless he let himself be captured on purpose, to find out who everyone involved in the scheme is. But he's still in real danger, Swift Wind reminded him. Whitney and his men won't hesitate to kill you if they don't get what they want. Margaret touched the scar on her palm, remembering the blood pact she had made with Fire Eagle. That promise went beyond physical protection. It was a commitment of loyalty and mutual trust. "We need a plan," she said, her medical mind working quickly. "Something that will allow us to save Fire Eagle without compromising the tribe's safety." Silvermoon approached, placing something in Margaret's hands. It was a small vial containing a dark liquid. "It's an ancient medicine of our people," translated Swiftwind. "When mixed with water, it creates a smoke that confuses the senses. Our ancestors used it in important battles. Like the one to come," Margaret added, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "But we'll need more than smoke. We'll need help from someone at the fort." "The messenger's brother," Swiftwind suggested. "He's still there, working as an informant for the sheriff after Morrison's arrest." Margaret nodded, feeling a spark of hope. "And he owes us a debt of honor after we helped reveal the truth about his brother's death." As the sun began its descent into the Arizona sky, Margaret looked at the agents camped nearby, then at the mountains where the fort was located. Somewhere between those stone walls, Fire Eagle waited, probably trusting that she would understand his greater plan. "We will need every warrior," she said, turning to Swiftwind, "and every ounce of courage we possess." The young Navajo nodded, a determined smile on his face. "To save our chief and our lands, we will give every last drop of blood." "It won't be that far," Margaret promised, clutching the medicine bottle in her hands. "Not if we can use the wisdom of two worlds to our advantage." The plan was formed, and with it, the hope of a tomorrow where love and justice could prevail over greed and prejudice. Now, it was just a matter of time and courage to put it into action. Margaret and the Navajo warriors' plan began to take shape as the sun began its descent over the reddish Arizona horizon. The federal agents' camp remained a silent threat nearby, constantly reminding them of the approaching deadline. Swiftwind had crept into the fort, carrying an encrypted message to the dead messenger's brother. The young warrior knew the secret paths through the mountains that the white men would never discover, ensuring he would arrive in time to coordinate both sides of the plan. "Ancestral medicine needs to be prepared with precision," Silvermoon explained through gestures and loose words that Margaret was already beginning to understand. The old woman mixed the dark liquid from the bottle with other herbs in small leather bottles. Margaret watched the process intently, her mind torn between concern for Fire Eagle and the crucial details of the plan they had devised. Each movement of the elderly woman was precise. Each ingredient added had a specific purpose. "Whitney and his men expect me to deliver the documents by sundown," Margaret said, more to herself than to Silvermoon. "But they don't know that we have our own secrets too." The afternoon progressed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. The warriors who remained in the camp prepared themselves discreetly, strategically hiding weapons and positioning themselves in such a way as to appear fewer in number than they really were. As the sun began to touch the horizon, Whitney and two of his men approached the camp. Margaret was waiting for them at the entrance to the main tent, her upright posture masking the nervousness she felt. "Your decision, Miss Williams?" asked Whitney, her arrogant smile revealing that she already considered victory certain. "I have the documents," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "But I want to see Fire Eagle first. How do I know he's really alive?" Whitney gestured to one of her men, who handed Margaret a familiar object, the protective necklace that Fire Eagle always wore, a gift from her mother. There were bloodstains on the beads. "That should be proof enough that he's alive," Whitney said. "For now." Margaret held the necklace with shaking hands, her heart clenching at the sight of the blood. But something about the pattern of the spots gave her pause. They were too regular, almost purposeful. "The documents are kept in a safe place," she said, biding her time. "I need to pick them up myself." "Don't take me for a fool, miss," Whitney replied, her hand moving to her holster. "2 of my men will accompany you." Margaret nodded, as if resigned. He led the men towards one of the furthest tents, purposely passing close to several fires where the wineskins prepared by Silver Moon had been strategically positioned. The sun was almost gone when the first signal was given, an owl cry that belonged to no bird. In a matter of seconds, the skins were thrown onto the fires, releasing thick, greenish smoke that quickly began to spread throughout the camp. "It's a trap!" Whitney screamed, but her voice was swallowed up in the ensuing confusion. The smoke, laden with ancient Navajo medicines, began to affect the invaders' senses, making them see shadows where there were none and confusing their directions. The Navajo warriors, who knew the effects of medicine and had prepared themselves with antidotes, moved like ghosts through the smoke, disarming and rending Whitney's men one by one. Margaret took advantage of the confusion to run towards the agent's horses, her mind focused on the second part of the plan. If Swift Wind had managed to reach the fort and contact the messenger's brother, Fire Eagle should already be... A shot cut through the air, passing close to his head. Whitney had managed to escape the smoke and was now chasing her, her figure distorted by the green haze. "You're not going anywhere!" he shouted, firing again. But before he could fire a third time, an arrow went through his shoulder, causing him to drop the weapon. From the smoke emerged a familiar figure. Fire Eagle, mounted on his horse, his bow still in position. "My love!" cried Margaret, her heart almost bursting with relief and joy. Fire Eagle quickly dismounted, catching up to her in a few steps. "The plan worked perfectly," he said, taking her in his arms. "Your message arrived via Swift Wind, and the messenger's brother helped us prepare our own ambush at the fort." "But the blood on the necklace," she began. "Red paint," he explained with a small smile. "A sign to let you know I was okay, and the plan was underway." The smoke began to clear, revealing that Whitney's men had been completely subdued. From the fort, more horsemen approached. This time they were the sheriff's men, led by the messenger's brother. "Whitney and his associates will be arrested," announced the sheriff, who had arrived with the group. "We found more than enough evidence at the fort about your illegal schemes." Margaret watched as Whitney was handcuffed and led away, her arrogance finally broken. Silver Moon approached, her face lit up with a satisfied smile as she spoke in her native language. "She says that the spirits always knew this day would come," translated Fire Eagle. "That good would prevail over greed and lies." "And now?" asked Margaret, still in her lover's arms. "What happens to the lands? To the tribe? To us?" Fire Eagle gently touched his face, his eyes reflecting the last ray of sunlight of the day. "Now we begin our true journey, as one people, one heart." Night fell over Navajo country, but for the first time in many days it did not bring with it fear or apprehension. The stars were beginning to dot the Arizona sky, silent witnesses of a victory that went beyond justice. It was a victory of love over prejudice, of truth over lies, of unity over division. Margaret looked at the scar on her palm, the mark of the pact that had changed her life, and then at the man who had captured her heart. The road ahead would still be challenging, but now they had each other's strength to face it. Dawn brought new energy to the Navajo camp. The victory over Whitney and his men had renewed the tribe's spirit, but it also brought with it new challenges and decisions to be made. Margaret, still processing the events of the previous night, found herself in the infirmary tent, organizing her medical supplies while reflecting on the future that lay before her. "The documents are safe now," said Fire Eagle, entering the tent with that presence that always made her heart race. "The sheriff will keep them as evidence until the trial of Whitney and her associates." Margaret nodded, her hands busy preparing more medicine for the still recovering children. "And Morrison, is there news of his lawsuit in Boston?" "The Telegraph brought messages this morning," he replied, coming over to help her. "His former allies are abandoning him one by one, revealing even more schemes and corruption." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken possibilities. Margaret could feel the weight of the decisions that needed to be made hovering between them like a cloud on the desert horizon. "Silver Moon wants to hold a ceremony," Fire Eagle finally said, his voice soft but determined, "to celebrate our victory and to bless us." Margaret stopped what she was doing, her heart beating faster. "Bless us." "Among my people," he explained, taking her hands in his. "When two spirits meet as ours do, when love is born of trials and trust, there is a sacred ritual, deeper than any blood pact." "Are you asking me to marry you?" she asked, a smile beginning to form on her lips. "I am asking you to join your life with mine, not only as wife, but as guardian of our people," he replied, his dark eyes shining with intensity. "As a healer who unites the wisdom of two worlds." Tears began to form in Margaret's eyes. All of his past in Boston, the fears he had carried, the uncertainties about his place in the world, seemed to dissolve in the face of the clarity of that moment. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "1,000 times yes." The smile that lit up Fire Eagle's face was like the sunrise over the mountains, bright and full of promise. He pulled her into his arms, sealing the moment with a kiss that spoke of love, trust, and a shared future. Silver Moon, as if she had sensed the moment, entered the tent wearing a traditional Navajo dress, richly decorated with beads and sacred symbols. The elder smiled as she spoke in her native language, her words translated by Fire Eagle. "She says this dress belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "It was worn at your own wedding, and before that, by many strong women of our tribe. It must now be yours." Margaret touched the fabric reverently, feeling its history and meaning. "It's an honor," she said, addressing Silver Moon in simple words she had learned in Navajo. Preparations for the ceremony began immediately. The entire camp mobilized, each person contributing in some way to the celebration. Women prepared traditional foods, men organized the large central fire, and children collected wild desert flowers. Swift Wind was sent to the fort to invite the sheriff and the messenger's brother, now allies and friends of the tribe. News of the marriage between the powerful Navajo chief and the Eastern doctor spread quickly, drawing looks of both admiration and disapproval from the region's settlers. "Some won't understand," said Fire Eagle, meeting Margaret in the afternoon, as she learned from Silver Moon the rituals she would participate in. "Our union will challenge many traditions, both of my people and yours." "Then we will create our own traditions," she replied determinedly, "based on respect, understanding, and love." The elder nodded in approval, continuing to teach Margaret the movements of the ceremonial dance and the meaning of each symbol on her dress. Every detail carried a story, a lesson, a promise for the future. By sunset, the camp was transformed. Torches and bonfires illuminated the central space where the ceremony would take place. The aroma of burning sacred herbs mixed with the smell of food and desert flowers. Margaret, dressed in traditional attire, her hair adorned with feathers and sacred beads, felt as if she were living a dream. Looking at herself in a small mirror, she barely recognized the refined doctor who had arrived from Boston weeks ago. "You look beautiful," said a familiar voice. It was the messenger's brother, who had arrived for the ceremony. My brother would be happy to see this day, to see that his death was not in vain, that he helped unite two worlds. Margaret felt tears in her eyes again. His memory will always be honored among us, she promised, and your courage will never be forgotten. The sound of drums began to echo throughout the valley, calling everyone to the beginning of the ceremony. Silvermoon led Margaret to the sacred circle, where Fire Eagle waited, regal in his traditional chieftain's robes. The ceremony was a mesmerizing mix of ancient chants, ritual dances, and sacred promises. Margaret and Fire Eagle renewed their blood pact. This time before the entire tribe and ancestral spirits, their lives intertwined not just by love, but by a shared destiny. Two rivers now become one, declared Silvermoon in Navajo, her words translated for all to understand. Two medicines come together to heal not just bodies, but hearts and spirits. As the celebration continued into the night, Margaret and Fire Eagle briefly stepped aside to watch the stars that shone brightly over the Arizona desert. "This is just the beginning," he said, hugging her from behind. "There is a lot of work ahead, many battles still to be fought." "And we will face each of them together," she replied, leaning back against his chest. As it always should have been, the future stretched out before them like the vast horizon of the desert, full of challenges, but also infinite possibilities. And under the starry Arizona sky, two hearts beat as one, united by a love stronger than any adversity. A year has passed since the ceremony that united Margaret and Fire Eagle. The territory of Arizona had changed significantly during this period, as had the small valley where the Navajo tribe built its new history. Margaret's tent infirmary had been transformed into a proper clinic, where modern and traditional medicinal practices coexisted in harmony. On this particular spring morning, Margaret was examining a small patient while Silvermoon prepared an herbal infusion at her side. The integration between the two types of medicine had proven not only effective, but revolutionary, attracting the attention of other tribes and even doctors in neighboring cities. "The future we dream of is starting to take shape," said Fire Eagle, entering the clinic after returning from a meeting at the fort. "The federal government has finally officially recognized our lands as protected territory." Margaret smiled, her heart filling with joy at the sight of her husband. The 6-month pregnancy slowed her movements, but it did not lessen her dedication to the healing work. "The news from Boston is also promising," she replied. "Morrison's trial is over. He and Whitney face many years in prison." Silvermoon muttered something in Navajo, making Fire Eagle smile. "My mother says our child will be born into a better world than the one we know," he translated, placing his hand on Margaret's belly. "A world where different people can learn from each other, instead of fearing each other." The little patient that Margaret attended to, a mixed-race settler indigenous boy, was living proof of this new reality. His mother, a young settler who had fallen in love with a Navajo warrior, was now part of the community, as were several other families who challenged the old barriers of prejudice. "Swift Wind has returned from his diplomatic mission?" asked Margaret, recalling how the young warrior had become an important intermediary between the tribe and the outside world. "Yes, and I brought more doctors interested in learning our healing practices," Fire Eagle replied. "Your work is inspiring change beyond our borders." Movement at the entrance to the clinic caught his attention. It was the brother of the dead messenger, now a deputy county sheriff, accompanied by his Navajo wife, another symbol of the integration that was beginning to blossom. "I brought news from Washington," he announced, handing an official envelope to Fire Eagle. "The Department of Indian Affairs wants to implement its integrated medicine model on other reservations." Margaret watched her husband read the document, noticing how his eyes shone with pride and hope. What they had built together, not just their love, but a whole new way of coexistence between people was becoming an example for others. "There's one more thing," the deputy continued, his expression softening. "We found Morrison's last documents in his office in Boston. Among them were letters that prove that his brother died trying to protect not just Margaret, but a whole network of people fighting corruption." Silent tears ran down the man's face as he continued. "He did not die in vain. His sacrifice helped build this peace we live in today." Silver Moon approached, offering the deputy a traditional Navajo necklace, a symbol that her brother would always be remembered as a warrior of the tribe, even though he was not born among them. The rest of the afternoon passed with special energy. Children played freely around the camp, some blonde and freckled, others with tanned skin and dark Navajo eyes, all together under the same Arizona sky. Their laughter was the music of a future that Margaret and Fire Eagle had only dared to dream of. At dusk, the couple climbed to the plateau, where they had hidden during their escape from Whitney's men. The place had become his special refuge, a place to contemplate the progress of his work and plan his next steps. "Sometimes I wonder," said Margaret, stroking her belly as she watched the sun set, "if this is all real. If I won't suddenly wake up in Boston, back in that life that seems to have taken place in another lifetime." Fire Eagle hugged her from behind, his touch gentle and protective as always. "It's as real as the baby growing in your womb," he replied, "as real as the love that brought us here." A movement in her womb, as if the baby was responding to its father's words, made Margaret smile. "Silver Moon says it will be a boy," she commented, "who will have his father's warrior spirit and his mother's healing heart. And the name we choose will honor both worlds he comes from," Fire Eagle added. "William, Warrior of Peace," in English and Navajo. Dusk painted the sky in tones of purple and gold, colors that seemed to celebrate the union of two worlds that once seemed irreconcilable. In the valley below, the lights were beginning to come on in the camp, now a thriving community where different cultures not only coexisted but enriched each other. "Our child will be born into a better world," said Margaret, echoing Silver Moon's words. "But there is still a lot of work to be done." "And we will do it together," Fire Eagle replied, "as we have always done since that first blood pact." Stars were beginning to dot the sky as they descended back to camp, where a spontaneous celebration had begun. Settlers and Navajo danced together around the central fire, sharing stories and dreams, building bridges where there once were only walls. Margaret watched as her husband joined the elders in a traditional song, his strong, clear voice carrying ancient words of wisdom for generations to come. Silver Moon sat beside her, her wrinkled hands gently touching her pregnant belly. "The spirits are pleased," said the old woman in the halting English she had just begun to learn. "You brought good change." Margaret held the hand of the woman who had become a second mother to her. "No," he replied, in Navajo, his words carefully chosen. "We brought good change, all of us, together." The future unfolded before them like the vast land of Arizona, full of challenges, but also endless possibilities. And beneath the stars that had witnessed their love rise and blossom, Margaret and Fire Eagle continued to write their story, not just for themselves, but for all who would come after them. It was the dawn of a new era in the Old West, an era where love proved stronger than prejudice, where healing came from both modern medicine and ancient wisdom, and where different peoples learned that their differences could be their greatest strength.